Welcome back. This is our summary for Chapter 4. Again, remember these are not complete summaries. I just emphasize some of the details that I know students always have difficulties with. Chapter 4, we're talking about sales contracts and how to make it work internationally. And again, every business has international aspects for it. You probably never thought about the cereal that you ate this morning being an international process, but it is. Not only do they have the same product and have to market it, but you have the problems of different countries have different labeling requirements, as well as not just translating the box so that it's read by another country, but all the other aspects of trade that are requirements for business in other areas. This is a product, Cheerios, which I'm sure everybody knows, that are being sold in Finland and how they are repackaged for all the different labeling requirements for Finland and the European Union requires. On the right is, no kidding, reindeer soup. As God is my witness, I thought reindeers were make-believe. I got there and found out, no, they're a big food source in Finland because they grow wild, like a giant wildebeest, and a lot of meat on a single reindeer. So interesting stuff. In America, where does our laws come from about contracts? The UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, the problem is most people, when they see the word universal, they think, oh, that's the international aspect of it. No, universal in the UCC applies to all 50 states. Because prior to the UCC, each one of the 50 states had their own rules about contracts. Now we've made it uniform across all 50 states, but other countries have dramatically different interpretations of contracts and rules. The one that's been a success for us internationally over the last couple decades is the CISG, Convention and Contracts for the International Sale of Goods. Again, this was a United Nations treaty, started in 88. America signed on. America is one of the signatories. Now we have over 80 countries, and by far, over 90% of all of U.S. imports and exports are with other CISG countries. And so, for us, this is our rules dealing with international trade. Now, how is it different than the Uniform Commercial Code or typical transactions? Again, a lot of it is very similar, but I highlight some of the areas where it's markedly different than what we typically think of as America's rules on contracts. One of which is the idea the CISG tries to keep everybody in the bargain. In other words, it pushes for compromise. In America, instead, we have just the opposite. If there's not a perfect meeting of the minds, remember that from 3113, there is no contract. So you've got to have a mirror image rule. Remember, the offer and the acceptance have to be the mirror image of each other in order for there to be a contract and a meeting of the minds. What you perform and the words of the contract have to be perfectly aligned. That's perfect tender. And if not, you've breached the contract. Again, America has very strict ideas about compliance and agreement of the contract. Instead, the CISG has a much more lax attitude. In other words, we expect when you are negotiating a contract between a person in one country with one native language and a person in another country with a different native language, there are going to be problems. There's going to be ambiguities. But instead, let's make it work. Let's do the best we can to make the parties agree with as much as possible what the original agreement was. It's not going to be perfect like we expect in the American legal system, but let's make it workable. When does the CISG apply? Again, as long as you have two countries, both of which have signed the CISG, then the CISG is applicable. Again, it's over 90% of our trade partners in America, of our imports and exports, are CISG countries. So this is a huge impact in our transactions. CISG excludes certain items. And again, I talk about it, the chapter talks about it in detail, but in the appendix, one of the appendix is the full text of the CISG. If you remember from 3113, the full text of the Uniform Commercial Code fills up several volumes. In contrast, the CISG takes up like 8 pages. It's very short, very condensed. But again, it's the things that we found were workable among all different countries with all different kinds of legal systems. So in the appendix, you can read the full CISG in probably 30 minutes. There's not a lot of detail there like American law has. Certain things are excluded from the CISG. In other words, even if you do have 2 different people from different countries transacting business, CISG doesn't apply to these kind. First and foremost is consumer goods. So if you're individually buying something over the internet from another country, CISG doesn't apply to you. Same way with things that are bought in auction, stocks, boats, aircraft, services, death, personal injury, basically all the tort issues that relate to it are not covered by CISG. As well as the CISG has an option that the parties can agree in writing to say, we know the CISG covers this transaction, but instead we're going to choose to be bound by the law of America or the law of Brazil. But again, that has to be arranged at the time you make the original agreement. In America, we have a requirement, remember from 3113, statute of frauds, the idea that any transaction over $500 or $5,000 must be in writing. In contrast, CISG doesn't require contracts to be in writing. In a lot of cultures, the idea that you have to write it down is foreign. It's alien to their way of conducting business. Instead, their business culture is such that you bring a lot of witnesses who watch the oral transaction between the two of you instead of a written document. And so for America, it's very, cumbersome to think that we would make a $25 million transaction and not put it into writing. But the CISG doesn't require it. It doesn't prohibit a writing, but it says it's not required in order to prove it. And then when you eliminate the burden of a writing, then you also have the same issue about what is parole evidence. Remember, parole evidence is the idea of what can you admit as far as oral testimony if you've got a written document. Well, if you don't have a written document, then you really don't have any concept of parole evidence because there's no conflict between what's written and what's spoken because there is nothing written. And so all those notions about parole evidence have a very different meaning in the CISG. Instead, for CISG, they consider everything. If you've got a writing, good, but also what did the parties say? And so our traditional notions of we only look to the writing go away when we're talking about the CISG. The CISG also, remember that idea of compromise? Instead of if A happens, then B, as American law typically works, instead the CISG always gives options to consider what's best. If A happens, then B or C or D or E. It gives the other party a variety of options, again, depending on the circumstances, which one of them could be financially best. So you can avoid the contract. One of the interesting things that CISG allows, in case goods are the wrong goods or they're damaged, is you just lower the price. And you go ahead and buy those goods as opposed to ship them back for 6 weeks across the Atlantic to the other country. Instead, you may buy them for 50 cents on the dollar and then turn around and resell them. And that may be the most financially viable option that you have among all those choices. One other concept that's also, again, very different than America's notion of law is even when you put in time periods, when we're talking about the CISG, we have this Nachfrist period. This is an idea of, basically translates into grace time. In other words, if you put in the contract, these goods have to be here by 12 noon on June 17th, and they don't show up until June 19th, Nachfrist period would say, that's probably close enough. It took them 6 weeks to get here by boat, and then they had to be transported by semi truck from the port all the way to Oklahoma City. The fact that they're a little late, unless these are goods that are going to spoil, like fresh flowers, that type of thing, that's close enough. The grace period says even if the time is on the contract, that you let the contract go on because of the long, long time periods and distances that are involved in international trade. One area in CISG, again, I told you it was vague, that is very much a problem, is its calculation of damages. Remember, in American law, we have the idea of direct damages, consequential damages, punitive damages. The CISG doesn't describe it that way. Instead, they define, damages as the amount of the loss. And so it's really unclear or unsettled from an American point of view about are consequential and punitive damages really covered by the CISG. And so that's an area of dispute that probably won't be settled for another decade. But those are, again, issues of how different it is international transactions than what our domestic law would be.